We're going to be looking at Acts 14 this morning. So we looked at, I know, a lot of verses last week. We're going to be looking at 7 verses this week. And guess what? My sermon is going to be just as long. So we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 7 of chapter 14 of Acts. So listen as I read God's word, or follow along with me. Now at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of His grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country. And there they continued to preach the gospel. We all have heard the term before, and we've used the term before. Well, that's typical. That's typical. Now, it may be in the way that someone has responded to something. So we can use it in the negative, right? So someone has maybe gotten angry at something. And we've seen this in their life, that something happens and they have a short fuse and they get angry very quickly. And we just say, well, that's typical. That's just the way they are. Or we could use it on the other side. You know, someone is in need and someone that we know goes to their aid, and maybe it's through food or maybe taking them to the doctor, or any number of ways that they come and they serve someone. And then when we hear about our friend doing this, serving someone else in this way, we say, well, that's typical. That's just who they are. They love people. They love to serve people and that type of thing. And so we can use that term typical. That's typical in a negative way or a positive way. Well, in these verses right here, we don't have much as far as details are concerned. They don't go in depth. It's pretty much this is what happened very quickly. But in these few words that we have here, we see a very familiar pattern that we see over and over again in Acts. And it's because of that just these few words that we have here, and the fact that they do remind us of so many things that we read before, that the passage is so significant. Because in this we see some typical reactions for both good and bad. Typical reactions of the apostles' strategy as they go into this new town. Typical reactions as to the people's response, both for and against them. But we also see a typical reaction to the church in response, the way they respond to what's happening here, the way they desire to resolve what's happening here. So when I say the church, I'm speaking primarily of the apostles in this particular instance. And so we see, again, 3 things that are typical, and we're going to be looking at those 3 things this morning. But before we do that, we're going to take a quick aside, because I love apologetics, you know this, and I love archaeology. I love finding out about the newest discovery and that type of thing. And so as I was studying this, something came out of my studies and I thought, oh, I want to share this. This is great. And it's this. In the late 18th century through the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, there was a lot of skepticism when it came to the Bible. Can we trust it? Can we trust the historical accounts? Theologically, really? Can we really trust in these miracles? Those types of things. So there was a lot of skepticism at this time. And archaeology as a science, the way that we think about archaeology today, archaeology is a well-established science. There are certain ways that you do things. When something is discovered, you take it through a process to discover its date and to discover what it was used for, all of these different things. So there's a well-established process that we use. Back in the late 19th, early 20th century, there really wasn't. Archaeology was just then kind of coming into its own. And so when people doubted, say, Acts, what was happening here? Paul's missionary journeys and the travels he took, and when they would look at the maps, or they would look at the towns and so forth that Paul said he studied, they would say, well, that's ridiculous. Those towns didn't exist at that time. Those routes weren't there at that time, and that type of thing. Now, why was that? Well, it's because they were most of the time looking at evidence that was after the first century. And so they would look at the towns, they would look at maps, and most of these maps were not from the first century. They weren't from the time of Paul. And by that time, we all know how names change, right, of towns, especially ancient towns. They don't change as much now. In the United States, we don't change names much. Although there are some names of towns around here I would like for us to change. But we don't do that today, but they did it then. Over the centuries, names changed of towns. Well, there was a lot of doubt when it comes to these verses that we're reading today and that we read throughout, that we will be reading throughout Acts, as far as the towns that he was going into and that type of thing. People just said this was created by people. Acts was created by people, written by people in the latter part of the 2nd century. That's what many believed. Scholars believed that's when Acts was written. And there was a gentleman by the name of Sir William Ramsay who bought into this. That's what he believed. He bought into the scholarship of the day that was saying that Acts was written in the latter part of the 2nd century. Well, Sir William Ramsay was very smart. He was Scottish, and he did much to shift scholarly thinking as far as what we think about Acts today by the research that he did back then. Now, he had bought into this, and he didn't believe that we could trust Acts. And this is a man that studied it all the time. He taught at Oxford University. He was a professor there. He taught archaeology and classical art. When he was teaching archaeology, it was in its infant stages, but that's what he was teaching. So he wanted to do a little research for himself. He wanted to be out there on the field. And so he says, I'm going to go to the Middle East. I'm going to go to Asia Minor, and I'm going to try to figure this out for myself. I'm going to try to figure out these cities and towns and what was really there in 1st century. That's what he was wanting to focus on, 1st century. Not that he desired to corroborate what was happening here in Acts. He really didn't care. Was not a believer, didn't believe this, but that was his area of interest. 1st century, Asia Minor. What were the towns at this time? What were the trade routes at this time? What the avenues or the roadways and that type of thing that people typically used? Where were they? And how often were they used? And how many of them were there and that type of thing? And from that, he was going to draw some new maps, so we could have a correct understanding of what Asia Minor looked like in the 1st century. So he went and he started doing all of this research. And he decided, well, I really need to use what's around. And so he used literature from that time period, 1st century. He didn't believe Acts was correct, but he said, you know what? That's really one of the few things that I have to go on. So I'm going to start reading Acts, and I'm going to see what they say about these different cities and the different trade routes and that type of thing. And maybe from that I could start getting close. Maybe there's some kernels of truth that I can use to really figure this out. So he really started from ground zero, rebuilding what we know or what we thought we knew about 1st century Asia Minor. And so he starts with the Acts. And he began to do so without expecting any information of value regarding the condition of Asia Minor at the time when Paul was living. That was one of his quotes. He didn't expect anything to come out of it, because again, he had accepted the current view. And that was that it was written during the second half to the second century by an author who wished to influence the minds of the people in his own time by a highly wrought and imaginative description of the early church. So that's the description of this author that we have, that they said wrote Acts. So he was reading in Acts, and then he gets to Acts 14:6, which is one verse that we read today, right? Acts 14:6. They learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country. Well, he's like, wait a minute, that's not right. what we know about that region in that time. There wasn't a city there named that, or this city. It wouldn't make sense to say you went into that city. It would be like saying he traveled from Richmond to Virginia. It just doesn't make sense the way the wording is right there. And he actually said that in his book. It would be like going from Richmond to Virginia. So that's to him, that was a major red flag. Okay, so he started diving in, trying to figure this out. So let's tease this out a little bit. Let's figure out what the real truth is here. He also, and so as he started to do some research and get into this, his eyes started to open up. He started to realize, wait a minute, this is actually true. Through looking at other literature from that time, he realized, wait a minute, these really were cities at this time. And then 14:7, a little bit later, 14:12 rather, what we'll be looking at next week as far as them calling Paul and Barnabas Zeus and Hermes, he realized and he found out that actually in this area that those were two of the gods that they still highly regarded at this particular time. So all these little clues started coming in, and he started putting them all together, and he realized, wait a minute, I think we can actually trust Acts. I think we can really trust what it says here about the cities that were there and about where Paul went and all of these different things. And it just, honestly, it changed everything. Because this is a man who was so well respected that when Ramsey came out with a paper saying, we can trust Acts, we can trust, indeed, what they say about these missionary journeys, he really did go to these cities. And he really did go in the way that it says he went. And this is what he says. The more I have studied the narrative of Acts, and the more I have learned year after year about Greco-Roman society and thoughts and fashions and organization in those provinces, the more I admire and the better I understand. I set out to look for truth in the borderland where Greece and Asia meet, and found it here, meaning Acts. You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment, provided always that the critic knows the subject and does not go beyond the limits of science and justice. This man started out as a skeptic, and he came to see that this is the truth. Theologically or spiritually, I'm not sure where he ended up. But historically, he said, we can believe this. We can believe every word that we see here as far as their travels are concerned. Now, why do I kind of take this aside? Because we can trust this, okay? I believe that we can trust not only historical accounts, but everything in here when it comes to the theological issues that it deals with, who we are, who God is, how we're reconciled to God, and so forth. But historically and archaeologically, the more and more we find, the more we discover, the more it corroborates what we know to be true about God's Word. And if anyone's interested in finding out more, talk to Charles Dumerisk. He loves this subject, right, Charles? He loves this subject, and I love talking to him about this. He's a wealth of knowledge. So, okay, I think everyone in here agrees we can trust it, but I think that was an aside well worth taking. So now let's go back, okay? Return to the three things that are typical. The apostles' strategy, the people's response, and the church's response to resolve. Okay, the apostles' strategy, first and foremost. So what do we read here? Now at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. Where did they go? Into the Jewish synagogue. Now, what's going on here, Pastor? Because last week, remember, they said, you know, you have turned our attention from the Jews to the Gentiles, but yet they're going back into a synagogue, and that's where the Jews were. Yes, that's where the Jews were. But it makes sense, especially in this particular time, right? The synagogues, what were the synagogues? Certainly the synagogues were places of Jewish worship, but it wasn't just Jewish worship, it was God-fearers as well, right? The Gentiles, who had come to believe in this God that the Jews worshiped. So they were there as well. So it makes sense. I mean, it's kind of like today's churches. If you want to find people who are interested in spiritual matters, well, go to the church. That's where you're going to find it. We are all interested in things of the Spirit. We are interested in spiritual matters, things of God. Well, Paul said, if you're at the synagogue, you're either a devout Jew or you're a Gentile who's serious about God. Who better to go and give the message to? And so he does that. We see him continually going to the synagogues. And we see that, yes, he is more and more turning his attention to the Gentiles. But in this particular instance, he knows, hey, I can 2 birds, 1 stone, right? Go to the synagogue. Hit them both. And so that's what he does here. He goes into the synagogue. This was his strategy. And I don't think we should take that lightly. I think Paul actually thought through, what should we do? When we go into this next city, where should we go first? Who should we talk to? He went in with an idea of how he was going to approach this particular people group. What do they believe? Where are they coming from? We know this when he went to Alexandria, right? He understood where they were coming from and what he needed to say to be able to be on the same footing with them so that they would listen to what he had to say. We need to figure out our strategy. We need to look to Paul. How did he do this? I think there is indeed a lesson here for us. Ask yourself that question. He would look at this and say, this is my open door. The synagogues are the open door. And they were, right? He would go and they would say, listen, come and speak at the synagogue. Or he would go into the synagogue and they would say, brother, do you have a word for us? That was very clearly an open door for him. Sometimes we have those opportunities, like we talked about last week, how I've had an opportunity just in the foyer a few months ago with one of our guys that plays basketball, and those happen all the time. And any number of you can tell me the same type of examples, those types of events in your life, experiences in your life, where that kind of open door has just been all of a sudden open to you. What a wonderful opportunity, and it's a no-brainer. I need to walk through because this is an opportunity that God has given to me. But sometimes we need to put a little more thought into our strategy. Just kind of think about our life circumstances. Think about what we're involved in. Think about, naturally our hobbies that we do and the people that we find ourselves around, our workplaces, just in our communities. Where do we find ourselves normally? And where's an open door? And what is my strategy going to be for when that door is there? How can I walk through it? How can I engage people? Yesterday, Jonathan and I signed up for the Charlottesville 10-miler training program. Yes, I know I'm insane. But on my way there, I started thinking, how am I going to engage these people? Now, what do I mean by that? As a pastor, when you're a pastor and you tell people you're a pastor, it really does one of two things. There's very, very seldom is there a middle ground here. They either kind of brighten up and say, oh, wow, great, where do you pastor? And that opens up a door of conversation. Or they just say, oh, okay, great. So I thought, okay, I'm going to be running with the people I don't know. I don't know where they're coming from or anything like that. What's my strategy here? How am I going to approach this? And so as you're running, they really want you to run with people so you can carry on a conversation. But I tried. I'm running along yesterday, and here's people around me, and I hear them, they're chit-chatting, and they don't even sound like they're out of breath. Here I am, I'm huffing and puffing, and this girl beside me starts a conversation. Oh, thanks. Okay, so I take a deep breath, and I answer her. I could barely breathe at this moment. But I'd have already thought through this, and she says, hey, so I'm Katie, I'm Todd. So what do you do, Todd? Well, actually, I guess I do a couple of things. One is I'm a pastor, and the other is I own a small software company on the side. And my strategy was, let me see where she goes with this. Let me see which one she's more open to. And as soon as I said pastor, I mean, literally, she's running beside me, and out of the corner of my eye I say, oh, I'm a pastor, and she just kind of goes, you could see it. And I just realized, you know what, I'm probably not going to get very far with that. So I added the software part. And you know what we talked about most of our conversation? Software, computers, those types of things. You know what? I now have an open door because Katie's probably going to be there on Saturdays when we go run. I'm going to have an open door to continue a conversation. Now, I don't do that every time. Sometimes I'll just tell people I'm a pastor. And if the door shuts, then it shuts. If it opens, it opens. More times than not, it opens. The only reason I tell you that story is to say we have to be thinking. We have to continually be thinking about what scenario, what kind of situation am I entering into here? And Lord, if you give me an opportunity, what is my strategy to make the most of that opportunity? So we can't be going through life passively, right? And let's be honest, most of us do. We kind of go through our different events in life and different things that happen in our life, and we go through very passively. I know what I need to do in this particular situation, in this circumstance, and you kind of go through and move through to the next thing. And what I'm asking you to do, and what I'm asking myself to do, is let's not go through these events and through these situations, through these opportunities passively, but let's be thinking strategically. How do I engage the people around me? What does that look like? And guess what? It could change every single time. But we ask God, as I go into this, help me. By the power of your Spirit, give me an idea as to what I can do. He's faithful to do that. So we look at the apostle strategy, and it's a typical apostle strategy here for him. And he understands what works, and he understands that this is the way that God has been gathering people for him. And so that is a wonderful strategy for him. We need to be thinking through the same thing. But then the number two thing, the typical response, is notice the people's response. Notice when he is proclaiming the good news, how are they responding? And we have two. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. And then we go down a little bit further. When an attempt to number 4. But the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. So what do we have here? We have one response where they were against. They were stirred up against the apostles. They were divided, right? Some were for them and some were against them. What does divided mean? It's a wonderful word. It's schizophrenia. That's where we get the word schizophrenia from. It means divided against itself, to be more specific. We have here people that are divided over Jesus. On the one hand, we have people that are coming to faith in Christ. That's what 14:1 tells us. That people believed. On the other hand, we have people that are being stirred up against them because they don't like what is being said. To the point where they want to stone them. This shouldn't surprise us, right? I mean, we think on the one hand, but wait a minute. But we also read in this verse that God is doing a mighty work. God is doing a mighty work through signs and wonders. You mean people are still against them? We shouldn't be surprised by that by now, right? Because we read about that over and over and over in Acts. God is doing a mighty work in their midst, signs and wonders, miracles. People are being healed in amazing ways. People are being raised from the dead. But yet still people disbelieve to the point that they hate them and they want to kill them. So we shouldn't be surprised by this. That some believe and some don't. That's what Jesus said, right? Simeon told us this. Remember Simeon when he was in the temple? Mary and Joseph, they bring in Jesus to be dedicated, and Simeon is there. And Simeon has been told by the Lord that you will see the Savior. You will see the Messiah before you die. And you would think that Simeon is going to say this blessing upon Jesus that is going to be, he's going to bring hope to the world. Many will be saved in his name. And that'll be about it, right? I mean, just a real uplifting, positive blessing upon the new Messiah who has come on the scene. But this is what he says. Behold, this child is appointed for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign that is opposed. And a sword will pierce him through your own soul also, so that thoughts from many hearts may be revealed. Whew. What is he saying there? He's saying, that there's some that are going to be believers, that they are going to follow the Messiah, but there's going to be a lot that do not. And indeed, through Jesus, people's deepest, most innermost thoughts are going to be revealed. What does that mean? That what was once hidden will now be revealed, because Jesus is ultimate truth. And it's through Jesus' work that truth is going to be revealed about us, about who we are. Whether we are understanding of our situation and bow before our Lord saying, Jesus, I can't do anything to save myself. I need you. And we bow before Him and we submit our lives to Him, or we turn from Him and say, no, I'm going to live my life my way and rebel against Him. Who we really are is going to be revealed because of Jesus. You either accept or you reject. Those are the two options that Jesus leaves for us. Luke 12:49, Jesus' own word says, I came to cast fire on the earth, and would that it were already kindled. I have a baptism to be baptized with, and how great is my distress until it is accomplished. Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, in one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son and son against father, mother against daughter and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. He does not paint a very pretty picture here. It's not like the gospel is going to go forth and everyone's going to be saved and we're just going to be one big happy family sitting around singing Kumbaya together. That's not the picture that Jesus paints here. Now praise God that there are many in this room today that indeed are followers of Jesus. And because of that, we have unity. We have love for one another. We're not divided against one another. And when division comes, we can work through it by the power of His Spirit. Because God desires us to live lives of unity with one another. But as far as the world as a whole, believers and unbelievers, there's going to be division. And within our own homes, there can be some who believe and others who disbelieve. That does not cause unity. That causes disunity. And sometimes it can get really, really bad. We all know this. We all know this. Maybe we know this from circumstances in our own families or friends that we know that have been going through this. Jesus' words, the words of the gospel, divide because they are truth. And some are going to believe and some are going to rebel. The gospel is indeed the source of our greatest strength and unity for most of us in here, but not for all. It divides many of us between ourselves and family members and friends and co-workers and neighbors, and this is the reality of the gospel that we live with. And we need to see the gospel realistically, that indeed that's what the gospel does. Not have this Pollyanna view of it, right? We just need to love one another. Let's just spread the gospel and share the gospel and serve people and everything's going to be okay. Jesus says, no, it's not. Because if you are faithful to me to share the gospel like I have called you to do, just know it's not going to be easy. People are going to come against you just as Paul and Barnabas see that they are coming against them here. Some believe, others reject. Some want to hear more, others want to stone them. We must in some ways embrace the opposition because we know that when we are being opposed, we're being faithful to the gospel. And that's a good thing. If we have no opposition in our life, if we're not making people uncomfortable, if we're not upsetting people because we are clearly articulating the need of the gospel, we are not clearly articulating how we are sinners and Jesus is our only hope. if everyone is getting along, if no one is offended by our words, then maybe we're not articulating them correctly. Maybe we're trying to soften them a little too much so people don't get offended. And brothers and sisters, we can't do that. It is the gospel and the gospel alone that saves. Not warm and fuzzy words. We have to lovingly tell people the truth and be ready for the opposition that will come. So we go to the third one now, and we see the apostles' response. How did they respond when two things were happening? A group of people became believers, but also a group of people were standing opposed to them. How did they respond? And we see really two different types of responses here. The first one is 3. So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of His grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that beautiful? What's happening here? The unbelieving Jews were stirring up the Gentiles, right? They were poisoning their minds against the brothers. That could not be fun. That wasn't a pleasant experience for the apostles to have to go through, to have people opposed to you, opposed to you, opposed to you. So what do? So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord. I love the way they respond to this. They didn't say, well, listen, look at the opposition that we're facing here. These people obviously don't like us being here. Let's just move on to the next city. Maybe it'll be better there. No. They said, no, yeah, it's hard. But we have to continue to proclaim the gospel. There are still people here in this city that do not know Jesus. They need to hear the word. But also, listen, look at the people that have come to Christ. Look at those who have believed. We can't leave now. We can't just leave them in their infancy. It would be like having a newborn babe and just laying them down and saying, okay, hope you fare well, and then moving on. These are our brothers and sisters who are new to the faith. And so, yeah, the opposition's not good and it's hard, but this is important. We continue to proclaim the gospel, and we love our brothers and sisters, and we help them to understand. We teach them, we disciple them. So we see them staying. That was their immediate response, right? That was a typical response. No matter how hard it got, they were going to hang in there because they understood what was at stake here. People's souls, people's well-being and growing in the Lord. But then we have another response as well. And this actually is fairly typical for when things got really, really tough. When they were about to be killed, they would leave. And so we see it here. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country. So when the tough gets going, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, right? So how do we reconcile these two? On the one hand, there's opposition, and evidently it was pretty bad, but they decided to stay. But now we have opposition of taking it to a different level, where they are saying they will stone you. Death could very well be imminent. I think Calvin has something good to say here. He says about this last part where they fled the city, and though they fled, lest they throw themselves headlong into death, yet their constancy in preaching the gospel does sufficiently declare that they feared not danger. For Luke said that they preached the gospel in other places also. Remember here where they leave the city, Lystra, Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country, and where they continue to preach the gospel. So they left Lycaonia, went to these other cities, and did what? They continued to preach the gospel. For Luke said that they preached the gospel in other places also. This is the right kind of fear. When the servants of Christ do not run willfully into the hands of their enemies, of them to be murdered, and yet they do not for slow abandon their duty. Neither doth fear hinder them from obeying God when He calleth. And so, consequently, they can afford, if need be, to go even through death itself to do their duty. So what is he saying here? He's basically saying is what they were figuring it out as they went here is that how do we pursue the best course of action that is going to cause the gospel to go forth? What is going to be a better testimony for the gospel? And they deduced it's better for us to move on at this point and continue to proclaim the gospel in these other surrounding cities. If we do not leave, we are going to be killed. And at this point, that's not the best thing for the gospel to go forth. So I think that's what we see here. In one instance, they say, listen, we're going to stand up to this opposition. We're going to stay here no matter how hard it is, because that is the best thing for the gospel to go forth. For other brothers and sisters to be strengthened, for others to hear the gospel, this is the best thing. But then the circumstances change. Death is imminent. They're going to be stoned. You know what? For the gospel to go forth, it is better for us to leave. I feel convinced that if Paul and Barnabas felt like, you know what? If we're stoned, we're stoned. If we're stoned, God is going to use it. And if we're stoned, that is the testimony that is needed to let people know we really believed and we were willing to die. And if they believed that indeed that was going to be better for the cause of the gospel, I feel confident they would have stayed. We see that they weren't afraid to die, right? We know that ultimately they did for their faith. But in this particular instance, they said it is better for us to go. We need to, again, figure this out for ourselves in our modern day context. You know, I see things on the news where I see other believers where they just push things, and they do it just to get a response. They do it to see if indeed they will be persecuted. You know, you read about a story, a believer being persecuted for standing up for their beliefs, but then you have other believers who say, well, let's push the envelope a little bit. Let's do something similar and see what happens in our community. And I don't know if that's wise. To bring persecution upon ourselves or to try to make a point, I don't think is wise. If persecution comes upon us because we are faithfully standing upon the gospel, faithfully proclaiming and faithfully standing upon His Word, then it comes. And when it comes, we have to make the decision. What do I do? What is my response in face of this persecution to continue the cause of the gospel? To bring glory and honor to the name of Jesus? What do I need to do in this particular instance? But I don't think we go out searching for it. I don't think we go out seeking those opportunities. I think we live our lives faithfully for Jesus. And if they come, that's when we have to make some decisions. That's when we have to figure it out. What do I need to do in this particular instance? So let me finish up with these questions for all of us, really. And I'm asking you these questions because I've been wrestling with these questions this week. What are your typical responses? What are your typical responses? Do you look for opportunities, as we talked about earlier? When you go into a particular situation, are you looking for open doors to share the good news? To share what Jesus has done and is doing in your life? Do you look for those opportunities? Do you go in with a strategy? That, okay, I'm probably going to meet some new people here. How am I going to introduce myself? How am I going to open up the door possibly to walk through so they can hear the gospel? Or at the very least to open up the door that will continue a relationship with them so that at some point I can? Are you going into situations with a strategy? Do you an opposition maybe comes? You've taken that opportunity, right? You've seen it and you've stepped in. You have a strategy, you've stepped in, but all of a sudden now maybe opposition is coming. How are you going to handle that? Because you need to have a strategy for it. Are you going to press in and engage because that may be what's called for? Are you going to back down? That may be what's called for as well. The problem is we don't want to press in and engage when it's really going to be detrimental to the cause of the gospel going forth. There are times when it's better to back down a little bit and to re-engage at different times. But let's not use the excuse of any time we are opposed or come against that we just back down and say it just wasn't the right time. Let's have a strategy for when those things happen, that maybe it is the right time to engage, to go forward. This is the question to ask, though, whatever situation you find yourself in. What response is going to best serve the cause of the gospel in this instance? That's it. That's the question we have to be asking ourselves. What response is going to best serve the cause of the gospel in this instance? And it may be a simple word of encouragement. That you're talking to an unbeliever, for instance, and you could just tell they're down, and you speak a word of encouragement into their life. That can open up a door of opportunity in the future. It could be any number of ways, right? And I'm not going to stand up here and give you a list of ways of possibly entering or making opportunities in your life. God will give those to us. He will give those to us if we're looking for them, and if we're willing to walk into them, if we're willing to engage them. But let's be asking this question in the power of Spirit, of God's Spirit. What response is going to best serve the cause of the gospel in this particular instance? Lord, help me. Give me wisdom in knowing. Now, maybe you've thought about this, and maybe your past typical responses didn't really look like the responses we see here of the apostles. Maybe we were much too quick to disengage. Maybe we were much too quick to back down. Maybe we were much too quick to engage, but in the incorrect way, in a way that actually shut down things instead of opening them up. So maybe as we think back through our responses in the past, maybe they've been typical for us, but it's a negative typical. It really wasn't the best way to engage, and it really wasn't the best way to further the cause of the gospel message. Let's commit to thinking about these things, that the ways that we saw the apostles engaging, their typical responses. And let's commit to change the way we respond in the future, to be thinking about it, to be asking God by the power of His Spirit to help us. And may they, by the power of His Spirit, who is in us and helping us in these times, because again, every appointment is a what? Is a divine appointment. Every situation that we find ourselves in is not just by random chance. I think God has something for us in those situations, for us to do if we are just open to Him and asking Him to help us to know how best to respond in those ways. So brothers and sisters, let's do that. We look at the responses here. The apostles' strategy. Let us have a strategy. The people's response, for and against. Let us rely upon God's Spirit to engage people both ways. Guess what? If they respond in the positive, what an opportunity we have, right? What an opportunity we have to truly share the gospel if they come to Christ, to then disciple them. We need to be ready for the opportunities and to respond accordingly, whichever way it goes. And then the response and resolve. We need to resolve in our hearts and in our minds that however I respond, I want to not be a hindrance to the cause of the gospel, but to see the gospel go forth. That should be our heart's prayer in every circumstance that we find ourselves in.